She was standing on my porch at 2 in the morning with my knees pressed against her chest and a bruise spreading across her left cheekbone like a storm cloud. I had been asleep for maybe an hour when I heard the knock. Not urgent, not frantic. That was the worst part. My sister Claire knocked on my door like she was apologizing for existing. 3 soft taps. The kind of knock you make when you're afraid of bothering someone. When I opened the door and saw her standing there in the cold, with 3-year-old Emma bundled in a blanket that wasn't warm enough for October, my body understood what my brain was still catching up to. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. I pulled them both inside without a word. Emma was already half asleep, her little fist curled around the edge of the blanket. I laid her on my couch and tucked a throw pillow under her head. Then I turned to my sister and I looked at her. Really looked. The bruise on her face was fresh. Maybe 2 hours old, the skin still swollen and tender-looking. There was a small cut above her eyebrow that had bled and dried. She was wearing one of Derek's old college sweatshirts and pajama pants and 1 shoe. She had driven 40 minutes to my apartment wearing 1 shoe. "Tell me," I said. She shook her head and looked at the floor. "Claire." I kept my voice steady. I had learned how to do that in the army. How to keep your voice level when everything inside you is screaming. "You drove here at 2 in the morning with your daughter and 1 shoe. You're going to tell me." She sat down at my kitchen table and she told me. It had started, she said, about 8 months after the wedding. Small things at first. Derek didn't like her going out with her friends on weekday nights. He thought she spent too much on groceries. He wanted to know where she was, always, who she was with, when she'd be back. She had explained it away as anxiety, as love, as the way some people showed they cared. When Emma was born, it got worse. He put her on an allowance. $60 a week for everything. Gas. Food when he wasn't around. Anything Emma needed beyond what he approved in advance. He took her name off their joint account and opened a new one she couldn't access. When she asked why, he said it was about budgeting. When she pushed back, he said she was ungrateful. The first time he hit her, she had been on the phone with me. She didn't tell me then. She hung up and told me later that Emma had knocked something over. I had believed her because why wouldn't I? Derek was charming and funny, and he had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring her soup when she had mono in college. I had liked Derek. I had hugged him at their wedding and told him to take care of my sister, and he had smiled and said she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, my sister told me it had happened 11 more times after that. 11 times I hadn't known about because she was ashamed. Because he had told her no one would believe her. Because he had told her she provoked it. Because he had told her she would lose Emma if she called the police. Because their pastor had told her that marriage was sacred and that she needed to pray harder and submit more fully to her husband's authority. I sat across from her, and I held both of her hands in mine, and I did not let my face show what was happening inside my chest. "Has he ever touched Emma?" I asked. "No," she said, and then she hesitated for half a second and I caught it. "Claire." He grabbed her arm once. When she was crying and he was having a bad night. He didn't hurt her. He grabbed her arm and I got between them, and after that he never did it again. But Rachel, he looked at her like, she stopped. She pressed her lips together hard. He looked at her like she was in the way. I breathed in slowly through my nose. I had spent 4 years in the army as a military police officer. I had dealt with domestic calls on base more times than I could count, and I had learned something that nobody tells you before you're standing on those porches. The danger doesn't look like a monster. It looks like someone's husband. It looks like someone you invited to Thanksgiving. It looks like someone who coaches Little League and holds the door open for strangers and has a firm handshake. The danger is charming right up until it isn't, and by the time it isn't, the person you love is already in deep. I knew how this worked. I knew what happened if I drove to Derek's house at 2 in the morning and put my hands on him. I'd be arrested by morning. Claire would feel obligated to defend him out of fear, and Derek would use it against her in court. I had seen it happen. I had watched women I tried to help end up more isolated and more trapped after a well-meaning brother or father made it about their own anger instead of about her safety. I was not going to make this about my anger. I put my sister and my niece in my bed, and I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I planned. In the morning, I made pancakes and I watched Emma eat 3 of them and ask for a 4th with a syrup mustache and a completely serious expression. And I thought about how she deserved to grow up knowing that someone always showed up, that she deserved to be raised by a mother who wasn't afraid in her own house. While Claire gave Emma a bath, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my old army buddy, Marcus, who now worked in corporate security. The second was to my cousin Dana, who was a paralegal at a family law firm. Then I sat Claire down and I laid out what was going to happen. "You're not going back," I told her. "I have to." You're not going back," I said again. "You and Emma are going to stay with Mom. I've already called her. She's expecting you this afternoon. You're not going to answer Derek's calls. You're not going to respond to his texts. You're going to talk to Dana's boss about a protective order, and you're going to start documenting everything. Every bruise, every threatening message, every time he shows up somewhere he shouldn't be. You photograph it, you date it, you send it to Dana." Claire looked at me with that expression I had seen on her face since we were children, the one that meant she was terrified of hoping for something in case it was taken away. "He'll fight for custody. He'll say I abandoned the marriage. He'll say I'm unstable. He has money, Rachel, and I don't have anything." You have me," I said, "and I have a plan." Derek Calloway was a sales manager at a mid-sized software company called Stratum Technologies in Columbus, 40 minutes from where Claire and I had grown up. He made good money, drove a nice car, and was apparently very well liked by his colleagues, who knew him as the guy who organized the fantasy football league and always remembered everybody's kids' names. He was exactly the kind of person whose neighbors would say they never saw it coming. Marcus helped me get a temporary position at Stratum through a staffing agency he had connections with. Administrative support, 12-week contract, starting the following Monday. I updated my resume, pulled my hair back, bought 2 cardigans I would never otherwise own, and became Rachel Simmons, temp admin. Pleasant and forgettable and very good at her job. I want to be clear about something. I was not there to hurt Derek Calloway. I was not there to threaten him or corner him or give him the kind of introduction to consequences that part of me very badly wanted to give him. That would have been about me. What I was doing had to be about Claire and Emma, which meant it had to be clean and it had to be documented and it had to hold up. I was there to build a case. The first week, I learned the office. Who sat where, who talked to whom, who went to lunch together. Derek's desk was on the 3rd floor, glassed-in office, the kind that said mid-level authority. He was handsome in a forgettable way, broad-shouldered, always with a coffee cup in his hand. He introduced himself to me on my 2nd day with a firm handshake and a smile that I recognized immediately. Practiced warmth, the kind people perform rather than feel. "Rachel, right? You settling in okay?" "Getting there," I said and smiled back. "Everyone's been really welcoming." He nodded like he had personally made that happen. "Good. Let me know if you need anything." I watched him for the rest of that week. I watched how he talked to the women on his team versus the men. I watched how he spoke to the receptionist, a young woman named Brittany who seemed to arrange herself carefully whenever he walked past, shoulders slightly in, eyes down. I watched how he took credit in the Thursday afternoon meeting for a report that I had already learned from 2 different people. His associate Lydia had spent 2 weeks building. I watched him work a room the way people do when they need to be liked, when being liked is armor. I also started noticing the phone calls. Derek took a lot of calls at his desk with the glass door closed, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he always angled himself away from the glass and kept his voice low in a way that was different from work calls. After the 3rd time I noticed, I started timing them. Late morning, usually around 10:30, 15 to 20 minutes. When he came out, there was something tight around his eyes that wasn't there before. On my 8th day, I found out who he was calling. I had been asked to cover reception while Brittany was at a dentist appointment. The office phone system showed extension numbers and outside lines on a shared display. At 10:27, Derek's office line lit up on an outgoing call to a number I didn't recognize. I wrote it down out of habit, the same way I used to write down license plates on base when something felt off without my being able to explain why. That evening, I ran the number through a people search database that Marcus had given me access to. It came back registered to a woman named Kelsey Morgan, 24 years old. Address in Dublin, Ohio, about 12 minutes from the Stratum office. I sat with that information for a while. Then I kept working. By the end of week 2, I had documented 4 separate instances of Derek taking work credit that wasn't his. One instance of him speaking to Brittany in a way that made her visibly flinch. He had snapped at her over a scheduling error. Nothing that would get him fired on its own. But I had written down the date, the time, and exactly what he said. I had also learned from the woman who sat next to me, a cheerful accountant named Pam who had been at Stratum for 11 years and knew everything about everyone, that Derek had had a complaint filed against him 18 months ago by a former team member who had subsequently left the company. "What kind of complaint?" I asked, keeping my voice casual, eyes on my screen. Pam lowered her voice. "Hostile work environment." The girl said he berated her in front of the team, monitored her bathroom breaks, that kind of thing. HR investigated, but nothing came of it. She left about a month later. She shook her head. "I always thought there was more to it." I filed that away. Meanwhile, back at my mother's house, Claire was doing something I hadn't entirely expected. She was getting angry. It had taken about 10 days. The first few days she had been quiet and shell-shocked, moving through my mother's house like she was still waiting for something bad to happen. She barely slept. She jumped at noises. Emma, picking up on her mother's anxiety with the radar that small children have, had become clingy and prone to crying. My mother, who had suspected something was wrong for over a year but hadn't known how to ask, had taken to sleeping with her bedroom door open so she could hear them both. But on the 11th day I called, and Claire answered the phone, and there was something different in her voice. "He's been texting me," she said. Sweet texts. Apologizing. Saying he's going to change. Saying Emma needs her father. Saying I'm destroying the family. And I read them and I thought. She paused. I thought, I know exactly what he's doing. I've watched him do this before. I know this is the part where he's nice before it gets bad again, and I felt something shift, like a door closing. "Good," I said. "I want to fight him," she said. "I want to really fight him, not just get away. I want him to not be able to do this to anyone else." I told her she was already doing it. Dana's boss had filed for a protective order based on Claire's documented history. Derek had been served. He was furious. I knew this because Pam mentioned that he had come in on the Tuesday looking like he hadn't slept and had bitten someone's head off before 9 in the morning. I watched him from across the office, and I kept my expression neutral, and I kept building the file. Week 3 was when it almost fell apart. I had stayed late on a Thursday to finish a project, and I was in the copy room when I heard Derek and one of his sales guys talking in the hallway outside. The door was half open. I stayed still. "Just feels like someone's been watching me," Derek was saying. "I can't explain it. Little things going missing." Things moved on my desk. "Dude, you're paranoid," the other guy said. "Diane in accounting does that with everyone's desks. She moves stuff when she's looking for the printer cable." A pause. "Maybe. Also, you look terrible. Go home." They walked off. I stood in the copy room for a moment longer than necessary, and then I finished what I was doing and I left. That night I called Marcus. "He's getting spooked," I told him. "I don't know if it's instinct or if I've been sloppier than I thought." "How much more do you need?" "Enough to make it bulletproof," I said. "1 more week." "Watch your back," Marcus said, which from him was not a figure of speech. The following Monday, I made a calculated decision. I stopped being invisible. I was friendly with Derek. Not flirtatiously, not obviously, just present. I asked his opinion on a workflow question. I laughed at a joke he made in the break room. I was warm and easy, and I watched him relax the way people do when they decide they've been imagining things. Within 2 days, he had stopped looking over his shoulder. On Wednesday of that week, Pam told me that a woman had called the office main line asking for Derek by name, and when Brittany had said he was in a meeting, the woman had said she'd try his cell and hung up without leaving a name. Brittany had mentioned it to Pam because the voice had sounded young and upset. I thought about Kelsey Morgan, 24 years old, Dublin, Ohio. I thought about my sister showing up at my door with one shoe. I thought about the way patterns work, how they don't start and stop with one person. The file I had built by Friday of week 3 included records of 7 instances of Derek claiming work he didn't do, documentation of 2 incidents of demeaning behavior toward female staff members with witness names, a written account from Pam, who I had finally told a carefully edited version of the truth to on Thursday, watching her face go from surprised to grim to quietly furious, confirming the prior HR complaint and the name of the woman who had filed it, call records showing the frequency of the personal calls, and printed communications between Derek and his attorney in the divorce proceeding, which I had obtained legally through Dana's office as part of Claire's case. On Friday afternoon, I walked into Stratum's HR director's office, and I closed the door and I sat down. Her name was Janet. She was 50-something with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who had been in HR long enough to have seen most things. I told her who I was. I told her why I was there. I put the file on her desk. She looked at it for a long time. "This woman?" she said, pointing to the name of the employee who had filed the previous complaint. "She's at Elevate Systems now. I've thought about her a lot since she left." "Call her," I said. "I think she'll want to talk now." I drove to my mother's house that evening. Claire and Emma were in the backyard. Emma was wearing rubber boots that were too big for her, and jumping in a pile of leaves my mother had raked, and Claire was sitting on the porch steps watching her with a cup of tea and the particular look of a person relearning what peace feels like. I sat down next to her. "It's in motion," I said. She looked at me. "Is it going to work?" "It's going to work." It took 3 more weeks for everything to land. Derek was placed on administrative leave pending an HR investigation 5 days after my meeting with Janet. The woman who had filed the previous complaint, her name was Andrea, had spoken to Janet and had then called a lawyer. 2 other female employees came forward with their own accounts. Smaller things, but part of a pattern. The kind of pattern that becomes undeniable once you stop looking at the pieces individually. The protective order held. Derek violated it once, showing up at my mother's house at 7 in the evening claiming he just wanted to talk. And Claire called the police while my mother stood on the porch and told him to leave with the specific calm of a 63-year-old woman who had decided she was no longer afraid of him. He was arrested for the violation. He spent 1 night in jail, which I understand is not a long time, but I will tell you that Claire called me from my mother's kitchen at 11 o'clock that night and laughed for the first time in I don't know how long. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep. The divorce was ugly in the way that divorces are when one party cannot accept that they've lost control. Derek's attorney argued that Claire had abandoned the marriage. Claire's attorney presented 17 months of documented abuse, the hospital record from 2 years ago that Claire had told the ER was from a fall, the financial record showing the controlled allowance, and statements from 3 people who had witnessed Derek's behavior. The judge awarded Claire primary custody of Emma. Derek received supervised visitation twice monthly. He was ordered to pay child support. He lost his job at Stratum 3 weeks after the custody decision. I heard from Pam, who still texts me occasionally, that he had gone to work at a smaller firm across town. I don't know what he does there. That part was no longer mine to carry. What I carry instead is this. 6 months after that night, she knocked on my door. I went to visit my sister in her new apartment. It was small, a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building 15 minutes from where our mother lived. Claire had gotten a job doing administrative work at a pediatric clinic. She had bought a second-hand couch in a blue that Emma had picked out, and there were crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, and there was food in the cabinets that Claire had bought with money she had earned herself. Emma showed me her room. She had a nightlight shaped like a moon and a collection of toy horses and a very serious opinion about which horse was the best one, which she communicated to me at considerable length. When I laughed, she looked pleased with herself. She had Claire's eyes and our mother's stubbornness, and she had no memory, I hoped, of the night her mother had driven 40 minutes in the cold with one shoe. Later, after Emma was in bed, Claire and I sat on the blue couch with glasses of wine, and she told me something that I have thought about every day since. "I keep waiting to feel like I got away with something," she said. "Like any second someone's going to tell me I don't deserve this. A normal life. A place that's mine." She turned the glass in her hands. "But I'm starting to think it's actually real, that it's actually mine." "It's yours," I told her. She nodded slowly like she was practicing believing it. "I want to say something to anyone listening who recognizes what I've described. Not the specific story, not the job I took, or the file I built, or the attorney, or the HR director. Those are details. What I want to talk about is the thing my sister said in that first phone call after she'd been in my mother's house for 11 days. The thing about the door closing. People who have never been in a situation like Claire's sometimes ask why someone stays. I asked myself that question too, before I understood better. The answer is that staying is rarely about love, at least not by the end. It's about money and fear and children and isolation and the very deliberate work that certain people do to make you believe that the world outside is more dangerous than the one inside. Derek had taken Claire's name off the bank account. He had slowly let her friendships fade by being difficult about her going out, by making her feel guilty, by creating just enough friction that it became easier to stop trying to maintain them. He had made her financially dependent and geographically close to no one who might help her, and then he had told her that if she left, she would lose the one thing she loved more than anything, which was Emma. He had built a very careful cage and called it a marriage. What I know, from the army, and from being my sister's sister, and from sitting across from Janet in that HR office, is that cages don't spring open on their own. Someone has to be willing to work the lock. And the work isn't always dramatic. It's not always physical. Sometimes it's documentation and phone calls and cardigans you'd never otherwise own. And patience. Enormous patience. The kind that keeps your voice steady when everything inside you is screaming. The night Claire had knocked on my door, I had held her hands across my kitchen table, and I had not let my face show what was happening inside my chest. What was happening inside my chest was that I was making a promise. Not to her, because she was already terrified of broken promises. I made it to myself, quietly, the way you make the promises that you actually keep. I promised that my niece was going to grow up knowing that someone always showed up. Emma's favorite horse, for what it's worth, is the gray one with the silver mane. She calls him Cloud, and he has a very important job, which is to stand at the front of the line whenever the horses are arranged on the shelf. She explained this to me with the gravity of someone entrusting me with critical information, and I told her I understood, and she looked at me with those eyes that are exactly her mother's eyes, and she said, "Good, because he's in charge." I thought about Derek for a moment when she said that, about the particular need some people have to be in charge, to be the one who controls where the horses stand and who has the bank card and when the lights go out and who you're allowed to call. And then I looked at Emma, 3 years old in rubber boots, already knowing her own mind, and I let it go. "Cloud, sounds like a good one," I told her. She nodded solemnly. "He's the best one," she said, and went back to her horses. Outside the window of that small apartment, the afternoon light was coming through at the particular angle that makes ordinary rooms look golden for a moment, the way light sometimes does in October. Claire was in the kitchen doing something quiet and unhurried. Emma was arranging her horses. The blue couch was soft and the little worn and perfectly fine. It was, I thought, the most ordinary and most beautiful thing I had ever seen.